Consider this, ladies. From today until the end of the year, you are working for free. This is no joke. This is the real effect of the gender pay gap.
It's a disheartening, dispiriting fact, but oh so real, even in 2024. And even worse, that free work actually kicked in last month.
So as you head out to work today, keep in mind that all the blokes are getting paid, but you, lady, no, you're working for free until December the 31st.
Kia ora, I'm Amanda Gillies, and on The Detail today, the gender pay gap, which remains a persistent and prickly issue in New Zealand.
A new report has found the gender pay gap extends all the way to retirement and beyond.
We may have been the first country to give women the vote, but when it comes to the gender and ethnic pay gap, well, we're well behind the rest of the world.
Right now, the gap is about 8.2%, meaning, on average, for every dollar a Pākehā man earns, women are earning about 92 cents for similar work. For Māori and Pasifika women, it's even worse.
For every dollar a Pākehā man earns, a Pasifika woman earns 75 cents. Let that sink in.
So, how does New Zealand fix this? What is the government doing about it?
The gender pay gap lives like dark mould in the back of a wardrobe because it's just not seen and it's not talked about, and this bill will blow it open, so let's do it.
That's consultant Jo Cribb.
What hat am I wearing? That is actually a hard question. Do you just want to say like a pay gap geek? Am I allowed to be that?
Oh, I love pay gap geek. That is perfect.
Well, I just think that's what I am, really.
And today she's talking all things gender pay gap, including the proposed legislation to fix the problem, which is currently before Parliament. In a moment, we will also talk to Sanoa Mali'i Karanina Sumio, the former Equal Employment Opportunities Commissioner at the Human Rights Commission.
And it's embarrassing for a first world country, for a wealthy country like us. It's embarrassing that you've got Pacific women earning, 20% less, than our European brothers.
But first, Jo and her own personal pay gap experience.
I had been acting up in a leadership role and was eventually appointed permanently into that role. And I was appointed into the role at my previous salary plus an acting up allowance. I trusted, my employer that I'd be paid fairly. But when I left the role about 3 years later and saw what it was being advertised, I had missed out on nearly, I could have bought nearly a house from those. It was that big, the gap. So I felt very angry. I felt the sense of just fairness and I guess that sense of being just deeply ripped off at the most innate level.
So she's backing the Employment Relations Amendment Bill, which is under review. It passed its first reading last month and submissions are open until the end of next month. It aims to expose and address pay inequities.
So what it will do is make any clause that gags or bans us from talking about our pay and conditions illegal. So basically, an employer can't contract away our rights to talk about how much we get paid. And when you think about it, it is kind of bizarre that such a personal and important piece of information isn't ours to share. So it will take the secrecy out of our pay rates. It's one step forward. It's not going to fix the world and the gender pay gap isn't going to disappear overnight. But it's the secrecy and the lack of transparency around pay. And I guess even the power dynamic around pay is the reason we have gaps. And most of us would probably don't even know if we are at the tail end of a pay gap because we don't have that degree of transparency. So it just basically levels the information playing field.
Because, Jo, talk us through the current situation, the current gender pay gap situation in New Zealand. How good, bad, or otherwise is it right now?
So it's been stubbornly stuck for about 2 decades. It's been hovering around 8 or 9 or 10%. So that's a substantial amount of cash, across the country that isn't going into women's pockets. But that's the average, right? That's our official statistics. currently, at the moment, so these are June 24 figures, the median hourly earnings for a man is about $35. For a wahine Māori, it's about $29, and for a Pacific woman, it's even less. So we're talking about an hourly rate difference of sort of $5 or so. That's a substantial amount of money that's not going into some families' pockets. So it is there, and it's stubborn, and it hasn't moved, and unless we give it a really good shove, it's not going to move.
This might seem like the most basic question in the world, but it's 2024, Jo.
Yes.
Why are we still dealing with this?
I think there is a range of reasons. There is a small percentage, and unfortunately I have met some of that percentage that just don't believe there is a gender pay gap. I call them the pay gap myth. So the reason there is a pay gap is that women don't want big jobs, or they aren't ambitious enough, or that they work part-time. Now, none of those are actually true and should contribute. If you work part-time, you should still be paid the same hourly rate as somebody who doesn't. And there's absolutely no research to say that women aren't as ambitious as their male colleagues, in terms of wanting to advance themselves. So there's a sort of sense that women, through their choices, deserve the gender pay gap. And we just haven't prioritised getting rid of it. There are some key pieces of particularly legislation that most other countries have put in place that we haven't prioritised. And I hope we say I haven't prioritised yet, because I don't want to be talking about this in 5 or 10 years' time.
Jo, is there the risk, though, that if this bill goes through, this could somehow, unintentionally even, make a workplace worse, increase tensions, make things uglier where people don't want to share their pay to others?
Yeah, well, the bill doesn't say you must share, and it definitely does not, and I don't think anybody would be saying that individual people's pay data should be shared. No one should have their own personal pay data exposed. But what it does is remove the barrier to sharing. It hasn't been the experience internationally when pay clauses have been removed. There's quite a few states in the US have been very proactive around these kind of measures, and they found that once the secrecy clauses were removed, that actually women's wages rose by about 12%, which is amazing.
The gender pay gap between full-time working women and their male counterparts is now the smallest on record.
So it's not saying you must share. You're not going to. All it does is give you control of your own data. And if you want to have a conversation with somebody, if you want to share it with your how much you're paid with an advisor, if you want to share it across the cubicle, you can do. Haven't seen widespread anarchy as a result of it.
That's good to hear. What about those companies who say, no, we're not going to do this, we're not going to have this policy? Would they be penalised, or is there anything in place for them?
So I guess that's a really interesting question about enforcement, how this bill would be enforced. And of course, that would be, once it's passed, is something to be worked out. But basically, it does give employees and I guess their unions legal remedy. And it does, I guess, open and potentially embolden people to share. So the devil will be in the detail of the implementation, but it really is, I think, an important step forward.
Employment Relations Employee Remuneration Disclosure Amendment Bill, first reading.
Camilla Bellich.
Madam Speaker, I move that the Employment Relations Employee Remuneration Disclosure Amendment Bill be now read a first time. I nominate the Education and Workforce Committee to consider the bill.
The bill, though, it's just passed its first reading last month. Did it get unanimous support? Did any of the men in there go, oh, hell no, I don't want this going through?
So it got support from nearly all parties, including some really quite, I think, powerful speeches positively from some of the national backbenchers. New Zealand First and the ACT party didn't support it, but it's got enough, momentum with National supporting it to get through. So this is a private member's bill. It was pulled out of the tin, and it is, I guess, a sequence of the work around pay transparency. So one of the National Party backbenchers was quite passionate of the fact that he didn't want his daughter being paid less, and now she could work it out. And that seems like a pretty rational response.
Because what is the estimated cost of the pay gap to women, to us, over our lifetimes?
Well, it's a pretty grim story.
The Retirement Commission has found that women on average have 20% less in their KiwiSaver than men.
And it's most extreme for women in their 50s, when the gap widens to 32%.
The consequences can be dire.
And we did a piece of research using the very, esteemed Mutu researchers and said, how much does this cost the country in having this level of gender pay gap? And they came up with $18 billion a year. So that's about how much as a country is missing from, women, especially our Māori and Pacific women's pockets. That's, this is a substantial chunk of change. I always think about it sort of as a tax for being a woman and being a Māori or Pacific woman. It's kind of like the tax you didn't know or didn't want to pay for or definitely didn't vote for.
Ladies, I hope you put your feet up early today to compensate for the fact you're still earning 9% less than your male colleagues.
And it means in total that men have far more when they retire. Particularly older women may have up to 30% less cash when they retire. And of course, this is all quite important because women are often living alone and living for longer periods of time in retirement. So it's a pretty the gender pay gap's got a pretty grim tale when you think about that in terms of tagging you right into your last sort of years and days on the planet.
I want to know, though, what is your advice? So someone's going to the boss and they're aware that the male sitting next to them doing the exact same job is earning, say, 10% more. How do you then approach the boss and say, actually, I want equal pay? What's your advice there?
Well, I think there's lots of ways of approaching this, and the first thing I would say is always do it in a way that puts you in the best position. So it may not be just you. The chances are if you are being paid less than your colleague, the chances are there's a number of you as well. So I always think there is a safety in numbers, and so that you've got a sense of support as well. I have seen people using their unions and in-place supporters to do that, to sort of ask. And I think the key thing I always recommend for particularly women when we're talking about anything about pay is that we really do have to be rational. As much as it gets to the absolute, intensity of our values and that we are, being literally ripped off, we should approach these conversations with a degree of rationality around why you are experienced, you've got these skills, and it is just a sense of fairness and right that you should be paid those levels. Many employers will respond, well, I don't think a lot of bosses go to work in the morning and say, who will I pay 10% less today? But we do have to approach this. Can you do it in numbers? Can you do it rationally? Can you use your employer's frameworks in terms of what the job is worth? And stand your ground. Let's stand our ground.
Does a female boss help at all when it comes to pay gaps? Is that on a female side or is that kind of neutral?
I wish I would say it was, but I think it's personality dependent. I think that would be what the research would say.
What's your message then to bosses, Jo?
That the best, most high-performing team will be the one where everybody feels valued, everyone is valued for what they bring, for their skills, for their experience, and that is then reflected in their pay. And it also has a huge impact on employee satisfaction. When people feel that they are valued, when there's a sense that their skills are acknowledged, they are actually going to, all the research shows, and it all just makes sense, they're going to come to work and work harder. And actually then as a boss, your life becomes easier.
And to make it even easier for bosses, last month the Minister for Women launched the Gender Pay Gap Calculator. It's a toolkit to help businesses identify and address pay disparities and includes tools for calculating gaps and creating action plans.
Basically a tool to make it very easy for businesses to report and to report in a standardised way. And that makes it easy for us. We can compare apples with apples. Like you're working in the media, you can work out which of the different media outlets' gaps are good or bad, and you can actually, if they're using the pay gap calculator, you'll be able to compare them apples with apples. So it gives us quite a lot of power. So it's a really positive step forward. We now have a national way for businesses businesses to calculate their pay gap. It's simple, it's easy, and I think that's, again, another step forward to getting rid of these bloody gaps.
You might be wondering if this legislation goes far enough as just being able to compare what we earn enough, or do we need another law to make it illegal to pay people differently for similar work? Well, we already have that. Here's former Equal Employment Opportunities Commissioner at the Human Rights Commission, Karanina Sumio.
We've had the Equal Pay Act since 1972. We don't have equal pay. So is it good or bad? It's completely unacceptable. When women are empowered economically, not only are they empowered economically and spiritually and so forth, but so are their children, so are their dependents. So the gender pay gap, it's about whole communities being left behind, and left behind from generation to generation when we don't address the inequities. So it's really fantastic. We have this amazing, beautiful country. We like to believe in fairness and decency, and that's why it's a great news that Camilla Billich's bill had gotten through with support from, well, basically we're talking about 90% of Parliament. That's fantastic. For me, it's kind of like, well, if ending pay secrecy makes sense to 90% of the population, do it already. Let's make it an early Christmas present. Because by doing that, we empower everybody, and especially we empower our women. And so it's really important that we address this right now. It's urgent. It's overdue. It's illegal. We have laws that, protect and ensure our equality. This is illegal stuff. It's being done by those in positions of power, economic power and political power. And we call on those who are empowered to do the right thing by all of our women. And by doing so, you do the right thing by our children and by our communities.
According to Stats NZ data, not only are Kiwi women paid about 9% less than men, when ethnicity is taken into account, the gap is bigger. And non-Pākehā men are paid much less than their white counterparts too.
So we have got deep-seated problems with sexism as well as racism, and an element of classism that's beginning to be embedded, which is why we must act urgently now. So hence the bill, I am so excited that the bill, across the political spheres, people see that it makes sense. So it aligns with our Human Rights Act, it aligns with our values. Make it happen already, for goodness sake.
I reckon, because what role does the pay gap play in perpetuating poverty cycles, especially for Māori and Pasifika women?
Yeah. I mean, when I first started as Human Rights Commissioner about 6 years ago, the ethnic pay gap, if we're looking at gender and ethnic pay gap, was around the 20 percentile, was more than 20% for Pacific women. That's just unacceptable. We look at the global scale. Where do we sit in the OECD? Oh, we're sitting around the top 5. Amazing, fantastic. Actually, let's look beneath the averages. And then you see that. And it's embarrassing for a first world country, for a wealthy country like us. It's embarrassing that you've got Pacific women earning, 20% less, than our European brothers. So let's do something about that, because that's just a symptom of the wider problem of discrimination. We've got deep problems. So, at least lift the secrecy, end the pay secrecy, and then people can see what they're dealing with and what they're going to pitch their talent for. It also means then that businesses who use the secrecy as a form of power to control their workers, that will remove that.
Do you think, or do you fear, that Māori Pasifika women, once the secrecy is lifted, that they could be a target again?
Well, they're targets now.
Can't get much worse.
They're targets now. And what we found with the Pacific Pay Inquiry that I led at the Human Rights Commission was simply giving people permission to speak up and say that I feel belittled, that I feel disrespected despite my loyalty and just giving people permission to speak out about pay inequity was so empowering. So by changing the law, it'll help women, but it'll help everybody, from the high levels to the entry level, to our young people coming out of uni, to our migrants who come and have no idea how much their talent is worth here. It'll help everybody. So yes, it can be seen as and there will always be, employers who will find a way, and that's just, I think that's just human nature. But we can't let that be the reason not to do the right thing and to do it urgently.
She says historically, Māori and Pasifika women haven't always spoken up or complained.
How do you recognize silence? Just because people are complaining about their pay doesn't mean they're happy. They're not complaining because they're scared they will lose the job.
And is that a big problem, Karanina? Because they are scared, they don't want to put their hand up, they don't want to be targeted?
It's a huge job. If someone with a disability has, waited 10 years to get a decent job, what are the chances that they're going to complain if they find out that the next person, they're doing the same job? So we have to factor in all of the people's life histories. If I've come from a country, I'm a new migrant, I've come from a country where if you belong to a union, you're targeted, your life is at risk. What are the chances that I'll join a union to come and help fight for me? We have to be really considerate and think about all these things. If I am a solo mum, and, I'm on the minimum wage, I've got 2 kids to feed, I've got the rent, I'm only making like $48,000 a year or so. What are the chances of me complaining? So we have to, in a way, we have to place the onus on those with power, who are the employers, who are the recruiters, to do the right thing, to take responsibility for that. People have got enough going on in their lives at the moment.
Because there is the financial toll of not being paid enough, but what about the mental and emotional toll, Karanina? Talk us through that.
Yeah. So I have suffered from this myself. Just the sense of being disrespected is really important. It's really important to Kiwi women. I mean, we're the first to get the vote, for goodness sake. And to be disrespected and to feel that despite your loyalty, our businesses, our workplaces become family to us. And so you expect to be respected and treated fairly and with decency. And when you find out that that's not the case, it really does hurt. It hurts you and it makes people angry. And so sometimes I hear from employers, well, if they get angry, they're going to leave. Well, people understand that if you have the same experience of everybody else or someone has more experience, they understand that you're paid less. Or if you have less qualifications, they understand that's not in dispute. It's when all things are equal and you're not being paid fairly. So that's when people feel angry and they feel disrespected. But that anger is there for you, but also if you've got kids who need that money to come so they can get some shoes and so forth. The ripple effect is really important. So I always encourage, I used to encourage the employers that I meet with, don't just think about your workers, think about those who are dependent on that dollar. Because that's a generational, there's a communal impact. And so if women are angry, they should be angry. And if they're angry at you as a boss, please do the right thing. They work for you, they help you be prosperous, fulfill your dreams. Just pay them well so they can raise their own families and have a life of their own and maybe have a dream or two of their own, It's not that hard. It's just human decency and dignity.
What do Māori and Pasifika women in particular add to a workforce, in your view?
Let's think about COVID. Who were the cleaners in those places where people had to go to when they had COVID? Whose lives were at risk? Who was at the supermarkets serving you at the supermarkets? Let's look at our nurses. Let's look at our workforce. Who was giving, put those things up your nose to test if you had COVID? If they weren't there, who was picking the cabbages and the fruit when we were in lockdown? Because we still had to eat. If they weren't there, where would we be? So think about it that way. We need each other. So respect our women, our Māori and Pacific women. By respecting them, you stop this transfer of hardship and poverty down to their children and to the next generation of New Zealanders.
That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thank you to Joe Cribb and Karanina Sumio. This episode was produced by Davina Zimmer and Gwen McClure and engineered by Jeremy Ansell. I'm Amanda Gillies. Matua.